Hi, so today we're going to be making a Pacific folding bar. This one was commissioned by my boss and it's been a great kind of project to use more recycled timber and also to start getting bigger. Pacific folding bar is a bar cabinet that in this case is going to have wheels and it's going to be maneuverable. Sides that'll fold out and the top will extend over to extend out to nice big long bar space, and to hold them up will be the doors of the cabinet in themselves, their own shelves, and they will come out and hold the weight of the bar top. It's great for either if you have little space and you kind of can't afford to have such a large bar, maybe in your house or in your backyard, or garden party scenarios where you might want to wheel the bar to the people rather than bringing the people to the bar. So this is what we kind of have come up with. We're going to do it in a two-part series because the video is just going to be so long. So in the first part, we'll be gluing up most of the panels. We will be creating this, which is the main cabinet itself, and as well as you'll see us kind of building other panels that will eventually turn into the side boxes and the tabletops. In part two, we'll then look into making the boxes themselves and then reassembling everything, finishing it, and getting it ready for presentation. So if you like what you see, stick around and we'll see how it goes. So we're going to be making this out of 60mm tongue and groove floorboards. These ones are recycled, so they're going to need a little bit of love to get them back up to scratch. A lot of them have got all sorts of crap all over them. If not, they're very weathered and they just need a bit of TLC. So let's get into it. So you can see the timber that we've got here is pretty shabby, as I described beforehand. I think it's either previously applied paints, or in some cases they did have like a clear coat put over them. So it took me a while to sand every piece down to kind of an acceptable level. There was all sorts of stuff in there. We're talking wall cladding, we're talking various paints. I'm sure it was not great for me, so I'm glad we got them to this stage here. To make the base, I selected some hardwood pieces out of the various lengths we had, and this allowed me to then go through and create quite a sturdy, strong base that everything can build off of. So using the miter saw here, we'll shorten a number of these pieces to length and then glue them up shortly. As you can see, when we're getting right up and close with this timber, there's a lot of imperfections in these recycled pieces of timber. Now, that's a good thing when you are trying to make something that has a bit of a rustic look, but as far as woodworking goes, it does add a level of complexity that you might not have considered. So something to think about when you're considering going down to a recycling shop. Do you have that extra time available to get into filling gaps and trying to untwist boards as you attempt glue ups? So once the boards are ordered, we'll then apply a generous amount of glue to each of those tongue and groove sections. Now, early on, I chose to put it in the groove itself, and then later on, I basically identified that as long as the tongue is well glued, that will provide a better gluing surface. And this is because a lot of tongue and groove boards, the groove itself is a little bit deeper than the tongue. So what that's going to then mean is you potentially kind of pouring glue in there that is not going to contact any surfaces. So it's better to weight your efforts on the tongue component. Once it's clamped up, just make sure that there are stretches in the center which will aid in trying to keep that piece flat. Some of these pieces that were, especially some of the larger boards, did need that support because tongue and groove are not perfect when they're cut, especially when you're talking recycled timber. We'll also grab here a nice big long piece of the harder woods and trim it down to create an edge banding around the base itself. So we'll then trim the lengths needed to create the edge banding itself, and I'll change out my Diablo fine finish blade for a flat curved Milwaukee blade. So this Milwaukee blade will then allow me to cut the half laps that I'm going to use as the joinery around the edge banding. This blade I find is much easier to cut half laps because the fine finish blade's got a bit of a sawtooth pattern to it, and I spend more time just trying to get a nice finish. Here you'll see as well, I just used a bit of a sacrificial fence, which was an offcut, and this allows me to get to full depth the whole way along, and then I always find just pushing it back underneath is a way to just nick out any of those little imperfections left by the blade if you moved it too far. I'll now use a level as a fence to run a circular saw along. So I've got here my DeWalt circular saw, and again it's got a fine finish blade on it, which means that I can get a nice accurate cut here. You'll also see I've used a small jig to measure the distance from where the edge of the plate is to where my fence is. Of course, if you've got a track saw, you won't have to do this step and you'll just be able to lay it down and go from there. Now we'll grab all our end pieces and we'll assemble the edge banding. This is a new toy for me, a biscuit joiner. You'll see me use it extensively and I'll talk more on it in a second, but definitely a kind of lifesaver when it comes to using these recycled timbers and not having to try and straighten them out without the aid, in this case, of a biscuit. So let's remove the base from clamps and we'll get on to making the front face panel. So going back to the miter saw, you can see that I am using a piece or a scrap piece in this instance to create a bit of a stop block, and that means that I can repeat these cuts a number of times over. When cutting for any of the glue ups that I did, of course I've overshot the measurement just to make sure that I've got enough distance to trim them to size, and here you can see me laying out what would eventually become the bar top itself. So we've got a nice selection of different colours and different shades, and you can also see some timber in there where it's got multiple shades in the length itself. Here I'm using a wire brush, so the tongue and groove sections themselves, of course, I managed to get a nice fresh surface on the main piece of timber itself. The tongue and grooves still needed a little bit of work, so we will use a wire brush to get any final debris from in there. And once that's done, applying a bit of glue to the tongue surfaces we discussed earlier. I use Type 1-2 for this application for a couple of reasons. The first one is that given that it's a bar, what I don't want to happen, I suppose, is in time the glue to break down because it's kind of not water prepared in the event that someone spills something, or as you'd probably expect, people wiping the bar down with a wet cloth. So Type 1-2 is likely to help me out in that regard, so we've gone with that. The other reason I've got heaps of it around at the moment. So we use a straight edge to now cut and shorten the overall length of this piece, and also of course to give us our reference surface, a nice square surface to attach what will be edge banding. So speaking of that edge banding, I've chosen to effectively frame each of these panels with a mitered rim around the outside. On the top and bottom sides, where there will be some end grain showing, you'll need to rip off any of the remaining tongue and groove sections from the timber to give it its flush surface to marry the two pieces up. However, you'll see I have left the remaining pieces either a tongue or a groove, so then they can marry up without the need of biscuits, which we'll do later on. So here you see me cutting the miters for that framing. To start off, of course, you always start out by cutting a 45 at one end, which will give me the ability to kind of judge the length. And if I'm not mistaken, I actually cut that backwards in that footage. You can see that I've in the past made a zero insert plate, and it's getting a bit worse for wear now that I've done a couple of 45-degree bevel cuts and other cuts that have undermined the fact that it's a zero clearance insert. So here's that using what I had available to me kind of in action, and we will pull out the biscuit joiner to support the glue up here. So I just got the biscuit joiner not long before this project, and I'm quite glad that I did. You can see me here using the Jason Hayes hip thrust technique that he speaks about when using his domino. As you can see as well, I've attached it to the dust collection system in my table, so that is a DeWalt quick connect system, and because they've got rubber boots that go over it, it allows you to connect kind of any tool up. It's relatively quick and somewhat inexpensive. So I'm using I'm using biscuits of number 20 size, and then for the miters, the actual mitered corners, I've used 10s, and this is just because of the amount of surface area. I found as I was going through this that a generous amount of biscuits going all around just meant the glue up went smoothly the first shot. One instance where I didn't use enough biscuits, maybe 2 or 3 per kind of side, it just meant that there was the ability for these older timber pieces to warp ever so slightly, and then of course you'd really struggle to get them square. So I suppose it's worth to note that these components of the frame here that you can see in the shot, which is end grain to side grain, this is where the piano hinges will eventually be attaching the folding out component of the top. And so the structural integrity here needs to be that it can support the weight of that hinge. And so that's why I've chosen to kind of go one biscuit on every single piece. I essentially figured that this would allow gluing surfaces that don't exist when you're gluing end grain to straight onto side grain. We've got the top, bottom sides of the biscuits themselves now here, all aiming to support the weight. And I think it came out in quite an easy glue up because of the amount of biscuits aligning everything. In the background, I've glued up another couple of frames, and these will allow us to create the sides of the main box itself. And instead of framing them in the same way with the mitered corners, this time I've just gone top and bottom, which should be plenty of support for what they're being used for. Once pulled out of clamps, we'll grab the Makita sander. I like this sander because it does have that Rotex-like mode where it's a bit more of an aggressive sanding pattern. It's a geared sanding pattern and will allow you to, in this case, really quickly flush up all the different boards because they don't tend to glue up flush with each other on the first shot. I'll then use a circular saw to grab one of these panels and create a flat reference edge on one of the sides. This then allows, in this case, to run these panels through the table saw and to flush up both sides of these panels. And in this case, we'll run the second one through as well. Now, one thing to note, if you are making panels and using biscuits, is just to make sure that you position the final biscuit on the edge far enough away. You'll see there, that little white piece was a little remaining piece of the biscuit sticking through. Bit of a status update. I've cut a lot of pieces up. We've got sides and we've got walls and we've got edging. It's all been cut out, and I just thought I'd show you kind of right now because it's right in the mess of it. So behind me here, you can see that is going to be the top. We've got some of the front faces of the smaller boxes. We've got edges of different various pieces, so side walls and so on. These are the side walls, so they will be getting glued up very shortly. And then we've got this to show. This here is the kind of first fit out and clamp up of the box itself. And it's looking pretty great, I must admit. We found some slight issues. You're going to need to shim every now and again here as we glue up. This is not level here, and this is drastically not level, so I'm thinking of using just one of this piece here. It's just a nice thin piece, gluing it on the top there. Given that this piece will not have, you won't probably see it because there's going to be a large overhang of the actual bar top. So we'll see how that kind of turns out. But here you go, there's a kind of a better look at it. That's looking really nice. We're starting to get quite... So there's still a lot to do, but I'm pretty confident that the pieces are coming together. We're really at that stage, we're starting to see things actually kind of pan out, whereas right up until this point, you've just been gluing together random boards and not knowing whether or not they're going to turn out well, what are the colours going to look like, so on and so forth. So it's come together, so we'll keep making stuff. So in the background, I've glued a number of longer pieces together, and this will allow me to create one larger panel, which will eventually be trimmed and shortened into the internal dividers of the main box. So once removed from the clamps, we'll start by running one of the edges through the table saw. Because we've got a nice reference on the opposite side, we didn't really need to repeat the circular saw trick that I spoke about earlier. And in this case, it was a pretty effortless cut through. Using the circular saw, we will cut the various panels to length. The fine finish blade on this circular saw means that I do trust the cuts that I'm able to eventually make with a circular saw instead of needing to, say, retrim them eventually on the table saw. So I chose to clamp it up in a kind of test fit manner to allow myself to then mark out where all of the biscuits are going to be. So I'm sure in this instance I could have used dowels, but I'm on a bit of a roll here with the biscuit joiner on this project. So we've gone around and used it almost like you might use nowadays a domino joiner and biscuited the internal dividers themselves. So after a bit of a test fit, we will get to gluing all of these panels up. It's probably worth noting that I definitely didn't have enough clamps or regular bar clamps for this glue up or some of the other larger glue ups. You'll see I substituted some ratchet straps, and I kind of highly recommend that kind of out of the box options, but it is worth kind of me saying that I did struggle at times to get square glue ups, and this is often because the ratchet straps tend to pull in a different manner to a bar clamp itself. So the first look at the finished glue up of the main box. I'm yet to attach the bottom and the top. But first, I noticed that there was some slight differences in the height of the box on either side, so just use a block plane to knock them down. So once I've lined up where I need that base plate to sit, I'm now here using a center punch to set where all of the screws will need to be drilled out. In this instance, I've chose to put screws and then plugs in, mainly just to make sure that the base itself is screwed and glued in the kind of sturdiest way possible. It's going to be supporting the weight of this bar, but it's also going to be supporting the bar weight whilst being on casters. So I chose to use screws for this fashion. I didn't use screws for any other component of this build. So you'll see me here working through hiding those screws using some plugs. In order to do that, we use a plug cutter. So if you haven't used a plug cutter before, it's just a simple tool that allows you to drill and then remove plugs from different pieces of timber. In this case, I used a couple of offcuts to try and, as best as I could, match the different timber itself. That being said, however, given the fact that this will be on the underside of the bar itself, it's probably not as vital to be perfect in the matching as you might say if you were doing a plug on a face that is going to be on your presentation side. So that being said, they did turn out quite well. I'll use the kind of Japanese pull saw blade I've got on this multi-tool to go along and flush cut those pieces, and then we'll use the sander to really blend in where those plugs are sitting. Final step on this one is to attach the top. So at first I went along, marked out, and then in this case used a texter to remark where all of the biscuits are going to sit. I find that using a texter is easier to spot when you are actually using the biscuit joiner itself for alignment. So another little update. So you'll see behind me here, we've actually got an upstanding bar now. This is kind of the point in which we start to really see these things come together. So we've got a combination, of course, of all of the different panels that we've glued up. So the top here, the sides, there's internals, and as you can see, it's right now covered in little black dots. And what those black dots are is a kind of new approach to filling holes. I found it on a website called Hammeroo, which is an Australian woodworking kind of website. It's a hot glue based system. So for example, we've got here our hot glue gun with a specific type of hot glue effectively, but instead of going to a rubbery surface, which your typical hot glue will go to, this is going kind of really solid. So we're about to see whether or not this system is going to be useful in holding all these gaps closed and to give us a nice clean surface. You'll also see kind of all around here, and particularly on the bottom down here, that we're also filling a lot of the gaps. So that's where we're at with the main piece. So stay tuned. So the final thing is to glue up the front panels of the two smaller boxes. You'll see me make those in part 2.
but just getting them glued up here with a edge banding of a frame like you would have seen on the front of the main box itself. And because we've done this a number of times, it was relatively simple to glue up, put some biscuits in, and then finally assemble these panels.
So there we are. First box made up, and we're well on the way to the side boxes and the tabletops. So hopefully in a very short time I'll have part 2 out and you'll see the rest of the build. But I hope to see you then, and cheers.